The phone call came mid-morning. Audrii Cunningham hadn't shown up. When her father received that call on the morning of the 15th of February, 2024, something in him broke open. Because Audrii had left the house, he knew that. He had watched her go. He had entrusted her without hesitation, without a second thought, to someone he knew, someone he considered a friend, someone he had allowed into the edges of his family's daily life. She never got on the bus. Polk County, Texas, a stretch of East Texas where the pine forests grow dense enough to swallow the light by midday. Livingston is a small community, the kind of place where people know their neighbors by name and vehicle, where children move through the world with the casual confidence that comes from feeling safe, where trust is extended, not earned, because that's how it has always been done out here. On that Thursday morning, that trust had become an open door to something monstrous. By early afternoon, law enforcement had been notified. By evening, search teams were moving through the river bottoms and tree lines south and east of town. And the community held its breath in the particular way that communities hold their breath when a child is missing, with hope and terror braided so tightly they become indistinguishable. At the center of it all, a man who had been close to this family, a man who had been permitted to live on the periphery of their lives, a man whose account of that morning would begin unraveling within hours. And when investigators reached back into his history, when they found what was already there in the record, this case became something darker than anyone in Livingston had yet imagined. Her name was Audrii Cunningham. She was 11 years old. This is what happened to her. Audrii Cunningham was 11 years old, and she lived the kind of life that 11-year-olds in small East Texas towns have always lived. She was a fifth grader who moved through her days with energy and personality. The kind of child who made her presence known in a room without trying. Those who loved her described her as bright, animated, full of life. She had opinions. She had laughter. She had the casual confidence that children carry when they have grown up inside a place that feels like home, surrounded by people who love them without condition. She loved her family. That was something that anyone who knew the Cunninghams understood clearly. And Audrii was, in many ways, the kind of child who still believed in the adults around her, who had not yet been given a reason not to. She lived with her father, Christopher Cunningham, in a rural community outside Livingston. Their life was built around the rhythms of a working-class family in Polk County school schedules, seasonal routines, the interconnected daily life of a small community where relationships run deep and neighbors are woven into the fabric of ordinary days. Don Steven McDougal was one of those people. He was not a stranger. He was someone Christopher Cunningham trusted enough to give him a place on his property. That level of access does not exist between strangers. It exists between people who have built something that resembles friendship, between people who believe they know each other. And inside that belief, inside that trust, lived the full catastrophe of what was coming. Before we go any further, if you're someone who needs to understand why people do the things they do, you're exactly where you should be. This is the Malice Mind. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to Audrii. Children live in the world their parents build for them. They go where they are taken. They trust the people their families trust. That is not a flaw in them. That is innocence. That is childhood, functioning exactly as it is supposed to function. On the morning of the 15th of February, 2024, Audrii Cunningham walked out the front door of her home the same way she had on hundreds of mornings before. Backpack on, school day ahead. The routine of a child's life, moving forward without interruption. Someone in her orbit already knew it wasn't going to be like any of those other mornings. The morning of the 15th of February 2024 began the way every school morning began. Don Steven McDougal had agreed to take Audrii to the school bus stop. This was not an unusual arrangement in rural communities, where distances are long and bus stops can be miles from a front door. Neighbors fill in the logistical gaps. Someone helps. Someone gives a ride. Someone takes a child where they need to go. It was a favor. It was trust made practical. What happened next, in the space between the family's driveway and the bus stop, is at the heart of what a jury would eventually decide beyond a reasonable doubt. What is documented is this: Audrii Cunningham never boarded the school bus. The driver did not see her. The bus left without her. And when the school contacted the family to report her absence, the official timeline of the morning began to collapse. Christopher Cunningham reportedly drove the route himself, tracing the road between home and the bus stop, looking for his daughter, unable to fully accept what the silence was beginning to tell him. There was no Audrii at the stop. There was no sign of where she had gone. Law enforcement in Polk County were notified within hours. Investigators began speaking with witnesses, retracing the morning's movements, establishing a timeline of where Audrii had last been confirmed to exist by anyone other than the man who claimed to have dropped her off safely. The Texas Department of Public Safety was brought in. The Texas Rangers, whose involvement in a case of this nature signals the severity with which it was immediately categorized, joined the investigation. Volunteers mobilized. By that evening, search teams were moving through the pine forests and riverbanks surrounding Livingston. The community organized itself with a desperate efficiency of people who refuse to stop moving as long as there is ground left to cover. For days, search efforts concentrated along the river corridors of Polk County, and specifically along the Trinity River, which winds through this part of East Texas like a dark vein. And then the search found what it had been most afraid to find. Audrii Cunningham's remains were recovered from the Trinity River. She had been murdered. The community of Livingston, which had held its breath through the search, found itself standing at the edge of something it had never prepared for. The window in which a missing child is most likely to be found alive narrows rapidly after the first hours. Every lead that doesn't materialize is time lost. Every hour of uncertainty is an hour of worst-case calculations. Detectives who work these cases carry that weight with them into every interview, every canvass, every drive along a rural road at 2 a.m. In the very earliest hours, they were working with a timeline that had a hole in it. Audrii had left her home with Don Steven McDougal. That was established. And she had never arrived at the bus stop. That was also established. What existed between those two facts, the minutes between the Cunningham driveway and the place where she should have been, was where this case lived. The first critical piece of corroboration came from the school bus itself. Whether through the bus driver's testimony, surveillance equipment on the vehicle, or other documentation of who boarded and when, investigators were able to confirm what the school's phone call had already suggested. Audrii had not boarded. She had not been dropped off at the stop. She had not been seen by anyone with no connection to Don McDougal after she left with him that morning. This contradicted McDougal's account directly. He had told Christopher Cunningham and would tell investigators that he had dropped her off, that everything had been ordinary, that he had watched her go. The physical record said otherwise. But in the earliest phase of an investigation, law enforcement cannot act on contradiction alone. They build, they verify. They work backward and forward simultaneously from every confirmed point on a timeline until the gaps close. And so, investigators interviewed McDougal, took his statement, and began the systematic process of testing every claim he made against the physical, digital, and witness record of that morning. While that work proceeded, the search effort around Livingston expanded in scale and intensity. Polk County's terrain is not accommodating. The forests south and east of Livingston are dense old-growth pine, heavy underbrush, creek beds, and drainage ditches that shift with seasonal water. The Trinity River. which moves through this corridor of East Texas in wide, slow bends before eventually reaching the Gulf Coast lowlands, does not yield what it holds easily. Search teams, law enforcement, specialized units, and volunteers who came from across the region worked the river corridor and the roads connecting McDougal's known location to the water. The community of Livingston turned itself inside out. Churches organized. Schools held meetings. Parents who had never spoken to one another stood together at the edge of tree lines, holding printed photographs of an 11-year-old girl and calling her name into forests that did not answer. The search for Audrii Cunningham drew a level of community mobilization that reflected how deeply a small town can feel the loss of one of its children even before loss is officially confirmed. But there were things investigators knew or were uncovering that the public was not yet aware of. When law enforcement ran a full criminal history on Don Steven McDougal, what came back reframed everything. He had been here before, not in this place, not with this victim, but in a situation that bore the same terrible shape, the death of a child connected to his presence and actions. In the early 1990s, McDougal had been convicted of criminally negligent homicide in connection with the death of a young child. He had faced a courtroom. He had been processed through the criminal justice system. He had returned to the world, and he had been given access to another child. It is the kind of detail that, once you hold it, makes every earlier assumption rearrange itself. The risk was not hidden. The record existed. And somehow, through the ordinary mechanisms of time and distance, and a system that does not always communicate with itself clearly enough, a man with that history had ended up with an 11-year-old girl in his care, on a rural East Texas road. Investigators now worked multiple tracks at once. The physical search continued. Forensic examination of McDougal's vehicle began. Cell phone records were subpoenaed, the digital log of everywhere a device traveled on the morning of February 15th, mapped against its owner's stated account of that same morning. McDougal had not been formally named as a suspect in any public statement at this point, but within the investigation, the geometry of the case had already resolved itself. There was one person at the center of it. One person whose story did not hold. One person who had been with Audrii when she left and could not account for her arrival. As search teams moved along the banks of the Trinity River, the question was no longer only where Audrii was. It was what had already happened to her. The case against Don Steven McDougal was not built on a single piece of evidence. The cases that hold under the scrutiny of a trial rarely are. They are built from multiple directions: physical, digital, testimonial, each thread coming from a different angle, each one arriving at the same place. The first and most direct contradiction was the account McDougal gave of that morning. He had dropped Audrii at the bus stop. He had watched her go. Under the kind of granular scrutiny that investigators apply to a timeline when a child is missing, that account could not be made to fit the physical record. The bus record showed she hadn't boarded. No witness placed her at the stop. The story had no evidence to support it, and a growing body of evidence to contradict it. The second track was the forensic examination of McDougal's vehicle. The third track was digital. Cell phone records are, in modern criminal investigations, among the most reliable forms of evidence available. They do not have memory lapses. They do not shade the truth in their own favor. They are a time-stamped log of where a device traveled, which towers it communicated with, when it moved, and when it was stationary. And the digital record associated with McDougal's phone on the morning of February 15th, mapped against his stated account of that morning, told a story that contradicted him. When Audrii's remains were recovered from the Trinity River, the medical examiner's findings confirmed what investigators already believed. This was not an accident. It was not a tragedy of circumstance. The cause and manner of death, as established through forensic examination, confirmed that Audrii Cunningham had been killed deliberately. Don Steven McDougal was arrested and charged with capital murder of a child under the age of 15. one of the most serious charges in the Texas Penal Code, carrying either the death penalty or mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When confronted with the full weight of the evidence against him, McDougal's behavior reflected the trajectory seen in cases where an offender understands they have been fully exposed. He had constructed a story the morning Audrii disappeared. That story had held for hours. By the time investigators were done, not a single piece of it remained standing. The community of Livingston, which had searched and prayed and waited, found itself at the beginning of a legal process that would take months to conclude. But the man was in custody, and the case that had been assembled against him was not going to come apart. To understand what Don Steven McDougal did on the 15th of February 2024, we have to do something the courtroom does not always have space for. We have to look past the charge and into the architecture of the behavior. Not to excuse it, not to reduce a child's murder to an academic exercise, but because understanding is the only thing that offers any protection against what people like this are capable of doing. And Audrii Cunningham deserves for the people watching this to understand fully, clearly what was done and why. Start with the structure of this crime. McDougal was not a stranger. He was not someone who selected a victim at random, who appeared without context or history. He was embedded in the Cunningham family's daily life. He had access. He had proximity. He had earned or been extended a level of trust that placed him in the car with an 11-year-old girl on a school morning with no one watching. In criminological research, this is referred to as predatory access, the establishment, whether deliberate or opportunistic, of closeness to a vulnerable victim through their family or social network. It is a pattern observed consistently in cases where the offender is known to the victim. The threat, in these cases, is not the stranger approaching from outside. It is the familiar face that is already inside. From the FBI's organized versus disorganized offender typology, a framework developed through behavioral analysis of convicted violent offenders, what we observe here aligns with organized characteristics. McDougal had a vehicle. He had a plan, however improvised, and critically, within hours of the crime, he constructed a false account and delivered it directly to the victim's father. He said Audrii had been dropped off safely. He said everything had been normal. This is not the behavior of someone acting in a dissociative frenzy. This is someone who understood the weight of what they had done and immediately began building a narrative to manage it. Now, to the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, a clinical instrument used by forensic psychologists to assess a specific constellation of interpersonal and behavioral traits. We cannot formally apply this without clinical assessment, but we can observe behavior that is consistent with several of the traits it measures. The immediate false account given to Christopher Cunningham reflects what the PCLR framework identifies as failure to accept responsibility, the redirection of reality away from one's own actions. The continued deception, while that father drove rural roads looking for his missing daughter, reflects a functional absence of empathy that is not situational. It is not someone who panicked and then felt remorse. It is someone who, while a community was mobilizing in grief and terror, maintained the posture of a person with nothing to hide. And then there is the prior conviction. McDougal had been here before, in the most terrible sense of that phrase. He had been convicted years earlier in connection with the death of a child. He had faced legal consequences. He had passed through the system. He had returned to the world with his core behavioral patterns, whatever they were, intact and unchanged. Forensic psychologists who study recidivism in violent offenders have consistently documented this pattern. The most dangerous individuals in a population are not always those with no history. They are often those who have moved through the justice system once, who have served time, been released, reintegrated, without the internal recalibration that the system hopes that process will produce. The warning was in the record. The record was not a sufficient barrier. The cognitive dissonance required to harm a child who has been placed in your care And to then look the child's parent in the face and describe a morning that did not happen is not an impulse failure. It is not a collapse of judgment in a moment of pressure. It is a functional ability to inhabit two separate realities simultaneously, the one that is visible to others and the one that knows exactly what happened and where. This is what clinical literature associates with callous unemotional traits, a feature of how certain individuals process or structurally fail to process the humanity of the people around them. It is what makes cases like this specifically terrifying, not the randomness, not the darkness of a stranger in an unfamiliar place, the intimacy, the access, the trust that was weaponized against a child who had done nothing except believe in the safety of her own life. The danger was already inside. It wore a face she recognized, and it used everything her family had extended to it. In January 2025, a jury found Don Steven McDougal guilty of the capital murder of Audrii Cunningham. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There will be no appeal. That sentence removes him from the world permanently. It cannot restore what was taken from the world. Audrii Cunningham was 11 years old. She had not yet graduated from anything, or fallen in love for the first time, or figured out what she wanted to do with the years stretching out ahead of her. She was a child in the most complete sense, still becoming, still growing into herself, still discovering what the world held. All of that was ended on a Thursday morning in February by someone who had been given the extraordinary privilege of her trust. Her father carries this. Her community carries this. The people who drove those rural roads and walked those pine forests and held her photograph in their hands, they carry this, too. Grief of that weight does not distribute itself evenly over time. It settles in. What Audrii's case leaves behind beyond the verdict, beyond the sentence, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. How often do we mistake familiarity for safety? How often does proximity to someone's daily life substitute for actual knowledge of who they are? How many times does a record exist somewhere that nobody in the room has seen? Cases like Audrii's remind us that behind every headline is a life that existed fully, completely, irreplaceably right up until someone decided it shouldn't. If that thought stays with you, it should. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if the Malice Mind is where you come when you need to understand the darkest corners of the human mind, subscribe. We're just getting started.